For 11 days in November 1983, the world came closer to total nuclear war than at any other moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the most terrifying part is that almost no one realized it. Not even Western leaders knew that we were seconds away from the first Soviet nuclear missiles being launched toward Europe and the United States. What seemed like a simple, routine NATO military exercise, codenamed Able Archer 83, was interpreted by the Soviet Union as the real preparation for a surprise nuclear attack. Kremlin generals placed their nuclear forces on maximum alert. Soviet pilots boarded their bombers carrying real atomic weapons. And inside the intercontinental missile silos, officers had their fingers hovering over launch buttons, waiting for the final order. Today, I'm going to tell you the full story of how a simulation exercise nearly triggered a nuclear apocalypse, and how humanity survived one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War purely by accident. To understand why this military drill almost triggered World War III, we first need to understand the climate of extreme paranoia that existed in 1983. And believe me, that year was particularly tense. Imagine the world of the early 1980s. The Cold War had been going on for nearly 40 years, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached levels unseen since the 1960s. Ronald Reagan had become President of the United States in 1981 with a hardline message against the Soviets. Unlike his predecessors, who pursued détente and dialogue, Reagan adopted an aggressive posture. He publicly called the Soviet Union the evil empire and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as Star Wars, an ambitious anti-missile defense project that terrified Soviet leaders. Why did it terrify them? Because if the United States managed to create an effective missile shield, it could launch a first nuclear strike against the USSR and then defend itself from the Soviet response. This would completely break the balance of terror that had maintained peace for decades, the principle known as mutually assured destruction. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the situation wasn't any better. Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief deeply distrustful and paranoid, had taken Soviet leadership in 1982. Andropov was genuinely convinced that the United States was planning a surprise nuclear attack, and this obsession became official policy. But here's where things get truly chilling. In 1981, 2 years before Able Archer, the KGB and Soviet military intelligence secretly launched a massive operation called Ryan, an acronym in Russian meaning nuclear missile attack. The operation had a single objective: detect any sign that the West was preparing a surprise nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. And I'm not talking about a small group of analysts reviewing reports. This was the largest intelligence operation in Soviet history. Thousands of KGB agents around the world were ordered to watch literally everything: blood supplies moving into military blood banks, lights left on in government buildings overnight, unusual movements of military personnel, changes in communication patterns, even the number of pizzas ordered to U.S. military bases. Yes, you heard that correctly. Soviet spies counted pizza deliveries. Their logic was simple but twisted. If there was a sudden spike in food orders to military bases, it meant personnel were working overtime, preparing for something big, potentially for war. This extreme paranoia didn't come out of nowhere. Soviet leaders obsessively studied military history, especially World War II. They vividly remembered how Hitler had deceived Stalin with Operation Barbarossa in 1941, making Soviet leaders believe that German troop movements were just military drills, when in reality they were preparations for the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin ignored every warning, convinced Hitler wouldn't attack. The result was catastrophic. Millions of Soviets died in the first weeks of the invasion. That historical lesson was burned into the mind of every Soviet leader. They would never allow themselves to be fooled again. So when November 1983 arrived, Soviet intelligence services had spent 2 years searching for signs of an imminent attack. They were hypersensitive, seeing threats in every shadow. And just at that moment of maximum tension, NATO decided to conduct its most realistic military exercise of the decade. Able Archer was the name of the annual NATO drill designed to train command and control procedures in the event of nuclear war. Every year since 1978, NATO carried out this simulation to ensure that, If the unthinkable ever came, Western leaders would know exactly how to coordinate a nuclear response. But the 1983 exercise was different. It was far more realistic, more elaborate, and more convincing than any previous drill. And these exact differences convinced the Soviets that it wasn't an exercise. It was the real preparation for war. Let me explain the elements that triggered all the alarm bells in Moscow. First, the exercise involved more than 40,000 NATO troops across Europe. Forces in multiple countries were mobilized simultaneously, something that required massive coordination. From Norway to Turkey, NATO bases entered a state of frantic activity. Second, they used new encrypted communication procedures that the Soviets couldn't decipher. Suddenly, radio signals they normally intercepted became completely opaque. For Soviet intelligence, it looked like a deliberate effort to hide real war preparations. Third, and this was crucial, the exercise included, for the first time, participation from real political leaders, not just military units. The entire chain of command was rehearsed, from tactical level to strategic, including the presidential authorization to use nuclear weapons. Fourth, new message formats and authentication codes were used for nuclear launch orders. Soviet spies reported that these codes had never been seen before, making them believe they could be the real wartime codes, not exercise ones. Fifth, the scenario was disturbingly specific. It simulated the gradual escalation from a conventional conflict in Europe to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and finally a full strategic nuclear exchange. The simulation began with a fictional crisis that escalated day by day, exactly how the Soviets feared a real war would begin. And sixth, the most alarming element, for the first time in the history of these drills, real nuclear-capable bombers participated. US and UK aircraft capable of carrying atomic weapons were put on alert, and some took off as part of the exercise. For Soviet observers, all these elements together painted a terrifying picture. They didn't see a drill, they saw exactly the kind of preparations the United States would make before launching a surprise attack. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying this content and want to keep learning about the most fascinating and unknown moments in history, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Every week we bring you incredible stories that will make you think. And now, let's go back to November 1983, when the situation was about to spiral out of control. In Moscow, inside the KGB headquarters and the Soviet General Staff bunker, alarms were blaring. Reports were arriving from every intelligence station in Europe. Something big was happening. KGB agents in Brussels, London, Bonn, and other European capitals sent urgent messages. Unusual activity at military bases, changes in communication patterns, movements of personnel. Everything matched the indicators they had spent 2 years looking for through Operation Rhine. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff, presented the intelligence to Yuri Andropov. The conclusion seemed obvious. The United States and NATO were using the Able Archer exercise as cover to prepare a real nuclear attack. This interpretation wasn't irrational according to Soviet military logic. In fact, it was exactly what they themselves would have done: use an exercise as camouflage to position forces and then, at the critical moment, turn the exercise into a real attack. It was classic military strategy. The Soviet response was immediate and escalated rapidly. Let me describe step by step what they did, because each measure brought us closer to the abyss. First, on November 8th, they put all the group of Soviet forces in East Germany and Poland on alert. More than 300,000 Soviet troops stationed in the heart of Europe were ordered to prepare for immediate combat. Second, the intermediate-range missile bases in Eastern Europe, those pointed directly at Western European cities, were placed on maximum alert. Technicians fueled the missiles, a process that normally takes hours and isn't done unless you're preparing to launch. Third, and this was truly terrifying, the long-range strategic bombers in Soviet bases were armed with real nuclear bombs, and their crews boarded the aircraft. They weren't sitting in hangars. They were on the runways, with engines on standby, ready to take off in minutes. Fourth, all military leave was suspended. Millions of Soviet soldiers across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were confined to their bases. It was the typical measure before launching major military operations. Fifth, surveillance of NATO bases increased dramatically. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft flew more missions in 1 week than they usually did in months. They wanted to know exactly what was happening. And sixth, the most serious detail. According to documents declassified years later, some Soviet commanders received preliminary orders to prepare preventive nuclear strikes. It wasn't the order to launch yet, but to be ready to do so within minutes if the final order came. Think about what this means. In some missile silo in Ukraine or Kazakhstan, a Soviet officer in his early 20s sat in front of his console, holding the launch keys. In some airbase in Siberia, a pilot sat inside his bomber, carrying dozens of megatons of nuclear power, waiting for the order to take off toward targets in the United States. Between November 8th and 11th, 1983, the world was on a tightrope. And the most terrifying part is that Western leaders had no idea how close we were to disaster. Able Archer continued exactly as planned. NATO commanders went through the simulated phases of escalation, completely unaware that every step was being interpreted in Moscow as confirmation of an imminent attack. The simulation reached its critical point on November 11th. In the exercise, the fictional situation had escalated to the point where tactical nuclear weapons were authorized on the European battlefield. Participants rehearsed sending authentication codes and simulated launch orders. To the Soviets monitoring everything, it appeared the moment had arrived. They were watching what they believed were real launch orders being transmitted. According to later reports from Soviet officers who were present, emergency meetings were held in the Kremlin. Andropov and his generals had to make an impossible decision. Would they wait to confirm the attack was real, risking destruction if they were wrong? Or would they launch a preventive strike based on what could just be an exercise? Soviet military doctrine was clear. If they detected unmistakable signs of an imminent nuclear attack, they must strike first. It was the only way to ensure enough Soviet missiles survived for retaliation. Waiting for the first enemy bombs meant losing the ability to respond effectively. We're talking about a decision that had to be made in minutes, not days. A decision that would determine whether hundreds of millions lived or died. So what happened? Why weren't the missiles launched? The answer isn't as clear as we'd like. There wasn't a dramatic movie moment where someone discovered the truth just in time and stopped everything. The reality was more ambiguous and, frankly, more terrifying. Several factors played a role. First, some Soviet analysts noticed inconsistencies. Certain preparations they expected to see before a real attack were missing. For example, there was no mass evacuation of U.S. diplomatic personnel from Western Europe. There were no significant troop movements. Second, the KGB had a high-level agent inside British intelligence, Oleg Gordievsky, who was passing information to the West. Although this wouldn't be known for years, Gordievsky also provided information to his Soviet handlers suggesting that Able Archer was truly just an exercise. Third, and probably most important, the exercise ended. On November 11th, according to the planned schedule, Able Archer 83 concluded. NATO forces returned to normal posture. Encrypted communications stopped. Everything returned to routine. If it had been real preparation for an attack, it wouldn't have stopped. The Soviets watched as NATO forces relaxed, and that was the final proof that it had indeed been only an exercise. Gradually, Soviet forces lowered their alert level. Pilots stepped off their bombers. Missiles were disarmed. Soldiers went back to their normal routines. The crisis was over. But almost no one in the West even knew there had been a crisis. Months passed before Western intelligence began to understand what had really happened. It was Oleg Gordievsky, the double agent I mentioned, who finally revealed the full truth when he defected to the West in 1985. Gordievsky told British intelligence about Operation Ryan, the extreme paranoia in Moscow, and how close the Soviets came to launching a preventive attack during Able Archer 83. The information was so alarming that it was taken directly to President Reagan. And here's something fascinating. Reagan was genuinely shocked. He read the intelligence reports about the crisis and wrote something revealing in his personal diary. He said he realized that many Soviet leaders truly feared the West would attack, and that perhaps his aggressive rhetoric had been counterproductive. This moment of realization fundamentally changed Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union. In 1984 and 1985, his tone softened considerably. He began talking more about arms reduction and dialogue. Some historians argue that Able Archer 83 was a turning point that eventually led to the end of the Cold War. On the Soviet side, the incident also had profound consequences. Andropov died in February 1984, but before his death he had begun to reconsider Operation Ryan. He realized that extreme paranoia could be just as dangerous as naivete. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, he brought a new approach. The policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were partly motivated by the recognition that constant confrontation could only lead to disaster. NATO also learned important lessons. Future exercises were designed with much more transparency. Measures were implemented to ensure Soviets clearly understood when something was a simulation. New direct communication lines were established. But the most important lesson was recognizing how easily misperceptions can escalate to the point of no return. You don't need evil or crazy leaders to start a nuclear war. All you need is fear, misunderstanding, and automatic systems that respond faster than humans can think. Let me be completely honest with you about why this story matters so much, and why I keep thinking about it decades after it happened. Able Archer 83 wasn't like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In Cuba, both sides knew there was a crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev were in direct communication. They made conscious decisions to step back from the brink. There was diplomacy, negotiation, and finally resolution. Able Archer was different. It was a crisis that almost no one recognized while it was happening. It was a massive misunderstanding that could have killed hundreds of millions of people even though none of the leaders involved truly wanted it to happen. Think about the absurd irony of this. Reagan didn't want nuclear war. Andropov didn't want nuclear war. The generals on both sides didn't want nuclear war. Ordinary citizens certainly didn't want nuclear war. And yet we were minutes away from it, not because of malice, but because of fear and misunderstanding. This event teaches us something fundamental about the danger of nuclear weapons. The problem isn't just that they exist. The problem is that the systems created to control them are designed to respond at a speed that exceeds our human capacity to fully understand the situation. Intercontinental ballistic missiles take about 30 minutes to fly from Russia to the United States, or vice versa. That means leaders have, at best, 20 minutes to decide whether a detected attack is real or a mistake, and whether they should respond. 20 minutes for a decision that determines the fate of human civilization. In that context, systems are designed to assume the worst. It's considered better to launch by mistake than not launch when you should have. But that logic leads to situations like Able Archer, where a routine exercise almost becomes the apocalypse. And here's what's truly terrifying. Incidents like this weren't unique. In 1979, a technician inserted a training tape into NORAD's early warning system, and for 6 minutes, U.S. computers showed that 2,000 Soviet missiles were incoming. In 1980, a malfunctioning 46-cent chip nearly caused a retaliatory launch. In 1983, just months before Able Archer, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov disobeyed direct orders and didn't report what his systems showed as a U.S. missile launch, trusting his instincts that it was an error. He was right. It was sunlight reflecting off clouds that satellites interpreted as missile launches. We've survived the nuclear age not because of intelligent design, but because of sheer luck, and the courage of individuals who dared to doubt their systems in critical moments. Now you might think, well, that was in 1983. The Cold War ended. Why should we care now? The answer is simple, because the danger never truly disappeared. In fact, in some ways, it's greater now. Today, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. There are roughly 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world, many of them on quick launch alert, ready to be fired in minutes. Tensions between nuclear powers haven't disappeared, they've just changed shape. U.S.-Russia relations are possibly the worst since the end of the Cold War. India and Pakistan, both nuclear states, have had recent conflicts. North Korea remains a dangerous wild card. And now, add new factors that didn't exist in 1983, cyber attacks that could compromise nuclear command and control systems, artificial intelligence making decisions faster than any human, drone technology that could be mistaken for missiles, and a widespread misinformation ecosystem that could inflame crises. Imagine an Able Archer scenario today, where a cyber attack simulates a missile launch, or where artificial intelligence interprets ambiguous data as a certain threat. The dangers have multiplied, not diminished. Additionally, institutional memory has faded. Leaders who lived through the Cold War, who understood the nuclear threat viscerally, are mostly no longer in power. A new generation of political and military leaders doesn't have direct experience with how close we came to disaster multiple times. That's why stories like Able Archer 83 are so important to remember and share. They're not just interesting historical anecdotes. They are urgent warnings that humanity has played with nuclear fire repeatedly and survived more by luck than wisdom. And here we are, at the end of this incredible and terrifying story. Able Archer 83 teaches us that the greatest dangers often don't come from evil, but from misunderstandings. It teaches us that the systems we create to protect ourselves can become the very things that destroy us if we're not careful. For 11 days in November 1983, Soviet soldiers waited inside their bombers, missile officers had their fingers on launch buttons, and the fate of hundreds of millions of people hung on decisions made by tired, frightened men operating with imperfect information. We survived. But we survived by a margin so narrow that it's frightening. We survived because some Soviet analysts noticed small inconsistencies. Because the exercise ended when it was supposed to. Because, at the last moment, caution outweighed paranoia. Next time, we might not be so lucky. This story should make us think seriously about the world we've created, where weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities are controlled by systems that must respond within minutes, where a routine exercise can be misinterpreted as the start of war, and where the margin for error has shrunk to almost zero. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep discovering the most fascinating, dangerous, and little-known moments in history, I invite you to subscribe right now. Give this video a like so YouTube recommends it to more people who should hear these stories. And tell me in the comments, did you know about Able Archer 83? What other near-nuclear disasters would you like me to cover in future videos? Share this video with your friends and family. It's a story everyone should know, because only by understanding how close we've come to the edge can we appreciate the importance of stepping back from it. We'll see each other in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the hidden chapters of history that changed the world. Until then, take care.